There are, however, or at least there have been, counter-arguments to the Egyptian evidence.
Let's find out about these counter-arguments that have been made on the Egyptian evidence, and let's see if it points us into a direction that's more truthful and more accurate in regards to the Israelites conquering the land of Canaan as described in the Bible. And so for us to do that, we have to continue reading in the book, The Bible Unearthed by Dr. Israel Finkelstein and Dr. Neil Asher Silberman, and see if we can get some understanding.
First of all, it was clear that the book of Joshua was not a completely imaginary fable.
They're saying that it was not a completely imaginary fable, but part of it was, and a big part of it at that.
It accurately reflected the geography of the land of Israel. The course of Joshua's campaign followed a logical geographical order.
And this is why the account was not completely imaginary, because the sites that are named in the book of Joshua had an actual existence.
At the beginning of the 20th century, a number of scholars selected sites that could be confidently identified with the progress of the Israelite conquest and began digging to see if any evidence of fallen walls, burnt beams, and wholesale destruction could be found.
Which is what we expect scholars to do when looking to verify the historical accuracy on the accounts in the Bible. And so they obviously were not satisfied with simply taking the narrative on face value, and so they went out to verify the claims.
The most prominent figure in this quest was again the American scholar William Foxwell Albright of Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, a brilliant linguist, historian, biblical scholar, and field archaeologist who had argued that the patriarchs were authentic historical personalities.
We talked about him before in this series, William Albright, right? He was a person who pioneered some of the archaeological techniques. And so he was brilliant, and brilliant in this field, right? As was already mentioned. And so it was he who argued on behalf of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as being people who actually existed.
On the basis of his reading of the archaeological evidence, he believed that Joshua's exploits were also historical.
He also believed it was true that Joshua led the Israelites into the land of Canaan by conquering it. And so he was one of the scholars who were optimistic about these narratives, right? And as a result, he was determined to find out exactly what he could.
Albright's most famous excavation took place between 1926 and 1932 at a mound named Tel Bet Mersum, located in the foothills southwest of Hebron.
This is located right here on the map, as you can see. It's just southwest of Hebron in the land of Canaan.
On the basis of its geographical position, Albright identified the site with the Canaanite city of Debir, whose conquest by the Israelites is mentioned in 3 different stories in the Bible. Twice in the book of Joshua and once in the book of Judges. Though the identification was later challenged, the archaeological finds from Tel Bet Mersum remain central to the historical debate. The excavations revealed a small and relatively poor unwalled town that was destroyed by a sudden catastrophic fire toward the end of the Late Bronze Age, according to Albright, around 1230 BCE.
This was during the 13th century, which is a time where the scholars will place the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan with the highest likelihood of happening if it were an actual historical event. And so Albright, he found an unwalled town that was burned down with fire during this time.
Over the ashes of this burnt city, Albright perceived what he thought was evidence for the arrival of new settlers. A scattering of coarse pottery that he knew from other sites in the highlands and that he intuitively identified as Israelite.
He related this to the Israelites coming into the promised land and doing just what they said they did in the Bible. And so I think this is reasonable for him to make this conclusion at this time, right? I don't think it was something that he was forcing.
The evidence seemed proof of the historicity of the biblical narratives. A Canaanite city mentioned in the Bible was set ablaze by the Israelites, who then inherited it and settled on its ruins. Indeed, Albright's results seem to be reproduced everywhere. At the ancient mound at the Arab village of Beitin, identified with the biblical city of Bethel, about 9 miles north of Jerusalem, excavations revealed a Canaanite city inhabited in the late Bronze. It was destroyed by fire in the late 13th century BCE, and apparently resettled by a different group in the Iron Age 1.
Right here is where Bethel is located on the map. And so through excavations, they found that this city was also burnt down in the 13th century, and it was settled by different people. And so we can see how this was starting to add up and appearing to support the biblical narrative.
It matched the biblical story of the Canaanite city of Luz, which was taken by members of the house of Joseph, who resettled it and changed its name to Bethel. Farther south, at the imposing mount of Tel Ed Duar in the Shephelah, a site identified with the famous biblical city of Lachish. A British expedition in the 1930s uncovered remains of yet another great late Bronze Age city destroyed in a conflagration.
Here is this city located on the map, and this was in the land of Canaan, and this was also discovered to have been set to flames, right, during the time that it would have happened if it were true in the Bible.
The discoveries continued in the 1950s after the establishment of the State of Israel, when Israeli archaeologists began to concentrate on the question of the conquest of the Promised Land.
The modern State of Israel was established in 1948, and afterward, according to these authors, the Israeli archaeologists, they wanted to know more truth about these claims as well, right? And so these people, they weren't planning to accept the narrative at face value, right? And so what did they do? They began looking for evidence.
In 1956, the leading Israeli archaeologist, Yigael Yadin, initiated excavations at the ancient city of Hazor, described in the book of Joshua as the head of all those kingdoms. It was an ideal testing ground for the archaeological search for the Israelite conquests. Hazor, identified with the huge mound of Tel El Wakas in Upper Galilee on the basis of its location and prominence, proved to be the largest city of late Bronze Canaan. It covered an area of 80 hectares, 8 times larger than such prominent sites such as Megiddo and Lachish. Yadin discovered that although Hazor's peak of prosperity occurred in the Middle Bronze Age, 2000 to 1550 BCE, it continued to prosper well into the Late Bronze Age. It was a fabulous city, with temples and a huge palace. That palace's opulence and architectural style, statuary, and other small finds already hinted at by the results of Yadin's excavations has since been uncovered in the 1990s in the course of the renewed excavations at Hazor, led by Amnon Bentor of the Hebrew University. A number of cuneiform tablets hint at the presence of a royal archive. The Hazor excavation showed that the splendor of the Canaanite city, like that of so many other cities in various parts of the country, came to a brutal end in the 13th century BCE. Suddenly, with no apparent alarm and little sign of decline, Hazor was attacked, destroyed, and set ablaze. The mud brick walls of the palace, which were baked red from the terrible conflagration, are still preserved today to a height of 6 feet. After a period of abandonment, a poor settlement was established in one part of the vast ruins. Its pottery resembled that of the early Israelite settlements in the Central Hill country to the south. Thus, for much of the 20th century, archaeology seemed to confirm the Bible's account.
And I think based on the evidence provided, it was reasonable to assume that these events did support the biblical claims. Now, we have to keep this in mind that this is during the 20th century, right? And probably about 75% of the first part of the 20th century, right? Not the full length. And so at this time, there was a lot of hooting and hollering happening, right? Because people, they thought that they were on to something.
Unfortunately, the scholarly consensus would eventually dissolve.
But that would all change when new evidence was revealed, which made all the honest scholars have to get rid of those old conclusions and make room for new ones. And so the evidence that made the scholarly census change is what we'll talk about in part 10, which will allow us to climb just one more rung on that ladder to get out of the pit and get into the free world where life is much better and it makes much more sense. And so this is the end of part 9 commentary on the book here, The Bible Unearthed by Dr. Israel Finkelstein and Dr. Neil Asher Silberman. And so I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.